Okay. So I think we'll have some more people join us as we go, but we can get started. My name is Ross Yelsey. I'm an Assistant Director of Admissions and Marketing at Columbia Journalism School. I'd like to welcome you to this conversation with Professor Winnie O'Kelley about the MA Business and Economics concentration at the school. And I'll let you know just the way the chat will unfold is we'll talk a bit about the program, some of the curricular aspects, some of the key things you should know about the program and things about applying to the program. And then we'll open it up for about 15 minutes at the end for some chat. And I'll be monitoring the chat in text throughout the event. I'd say I would reserve your questions till the end of the event, and I'll look at those and I'll pick out as many as I can. We'll discuss those in that last 15 minutes. So that's just the way we'll do this. And so to start off, I'll ask Professor O'Kelley to introduce yourself and maybe tell the audience a little bit about your own background in journalism and how you got drawn particularly to the area of business and economics journalism.
Oh, thank you, Rod. Thanks so much. Yeah, so I've been in business and economics journalism for about 35 years. Oh my goodness, I'm aging quickly here. It's something I fell into. I'm not sure too many people think at the very beginning of their careers, that's definitely what I want to do. But I had a facility with not just language, but also with math and numbers. I was always comfortable with it. In fact, I almost went into an engineering school, and I'm certainly glad I went another route. I have had the pleasure and the opportunity to help do a lot of first drafts on history on some of the most important economic and business developments of those few decades. My specialty is sort of in accountability, and the financial crisis was like one of those moments. Let's see, we can talk about from the NASDAQ.com bust back in so long ago, around 2000, to 9/11, getting Wall Street back up and running. And honestly, when we got to the financial crisis, I said, this is the culmination of my career. I dealt with lots of bank failures and insurance failures and companies that had had fraud and failed, like Enron, and overseeing that kind of work for many years, mostly at the New York Times, where I was for 20 years, and then more recently at Bloomberg, where I've been for the last 7 to 8 years. And I thought it was all sort of culminating in the financial crisis, because that was the biggest thing I could imagine happening. And it sort of took over my life for a long time. And now it's been eclipsed by the pandemic induced recession. So careful what you say, it just keeps going. But a lot of what I would do when people ask me why I care about business and economics journalism, I would say, first off, it's intellectually really challenging. It's not just reporting and talking to people all the time. You're really pushing yourself all the time, whether it's onto antitrust or whether it's onto privacy issues or something else, or complex money laundering or tax fraud. But it also gives you the opportunity to do something that I think is really important, which is to be a watchdog of capitalism, because frankly, it's something that government and regulators don't have enough bandwidth to do, and it's an exciting opportunity.
Thanks, Winnie. And so this is part of the Master of Arts program at Columbia Journalism School, which is for experienced journalists. And it's a 9-month program for anybody who's in that. And it has 4 concentrations, this one, and then arts and culture, politics, and science. And I thought I'd ask you a bit about the background of this particular concentration and why you feel like Columbia, it's important to have this kind of specific training in business and economics journalism for students who are so inclined to take part in it.
Right. So if you want to do the kind of things I was just talking about, you've got to be able to talk the talk. You know, you've got to be able to hold your own against people who are going to try to spin you or mislead you. You're going to have to do some in-depth work trying to understand financial flows of information. All of that requires some skills, and there are a smattering of skills from business and financial and legal and regulatory and just plain old interviewing and skullduggery. And I really think if you can get that kind of a background, you can aim so much higher. So you can bring it all to bear, whether it's investigative and data journalism, to really go after what I think are really big, important targets. And, you know, honestly, there's a lot of economic illiteracy out there in the world. Right now, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, what will happen to the economy if you do X or Y. And I think we want to help the population understand that. It's one of our jobs is to convey the information that they may be lacking. So remember that when we talk about economics, we're really just talking about your livelihood, your work, and the lifeblood of our economy. And so you want to get down into those things and be able to understand them and understand the decisions that are made by all the people, whether it's the consumer, the individual, the business leader, the CEO, the investor, or the policy person who's deciding in Washington how we're going to approach something, whether it's taking on Google in an antitrust case, or more regulation, or redistributing money by changing our tax system.
Great. And as I mentioned, the Master of Arts program is for what we call experienced journalists. And I wanted to ask, what do you think makes for an applicant to this particular type of program? What kind of experience should somebody have in journalism to do well, kind of starting from day one in the MA business concentration?
So we do get a lot of diversity. I don't want to pretend that there's only one formula, because I think that would be misleading. And I have a really diverse class this year, and I love it. A really great class, by the way. But typically we like to say someone who's been doing journalism or journalism adjacent for like three to 5 years. So you've had a little experience. You understand basic news story structure, how to interview, to collect information, and to prepare maybe a news story. Sometimes I get people who maybe were doing something kind of adjacent, some kind of research work. Maybe they were the editor of their college paper, or they did a couple of internships, but they wound up going into research or PR, or doing a blog, or doing something that maybe wasn't as hardcore journalism as, and they really want to get into that. And I think it's hard to make the leap. So that tends to be the kind of person. But I want to acknowledge, I have two students who were economics majors in this year's class, but have not done as much journalism. They've been more research types. And so they're looking to try to get that skill set going. But the MS program, by contrast, is really geared toward people who are learning like the basics, the ABCs of journalism. So inverted pyramid, the who, what, when, where, how do you get balance in a story? How do you collect information? Writing on deadline. That's really the MS program. In this program, I'm really focused on trying to give you that knowledge that will give you confidence to go out and write about businesses and individuals in the economy.
And to follow up on that, if, say, I was working as a journalist in a different realm of journalism, say sports or politics or the arts, would I still be someone who could be eligible for this program, even though this is a different type of journalism?
Yeah, thanks for making that point, because I should have. As Ross and I were just talking about before, I had someone in class this year who had done some work as a sports journalist, and the year before someone who'd been a photographer and wanted to sort of make the transition. And I actually think that's maybe the most use for the program in some ways. When I was at the Times, and I worked for Joe Lelyveld when he was executive editor of the paper, he used to make anyone who was going abroad to be a foreign correspondent have to come through my business desk, because he said they had to know those skills in order to be an effective and successful foreign correspondent. So I tend to think of the work like that. If you're going to be an education reporter, if you're going to cover Washington, if you're going to cover politics, if you're going to go to be a foreign correspondent, you want to check the box and have the basic financial building blocks in order to do that well, so that you can follow the money in all of those aspects and understand it. So yeah, I do think it's a great place for people who maybe even aren't going to go out and be business journalists afterward, but maybe going to be some other kind of journalist, but know this is a big gap in their knowledge.
And now looking at how the program is kind of spread out over the 2 semesters. So our MA program is a 9-month program, 2 semesters, fall and spring. And there's a core seminar. This would be the business one. It meets usually twice a week for those both semesters. And Professor Okelly teaches both semesters at this point. So you work with students throughout the whole year. Can you talk a little bit about how you design the syllabus and the certain key aspects of the curriculum that you'll offer to students in the program?
Oh, sure. So it's kind of fun, actually. It is kind of a yin and yang thing. In the fall, we really take on the macro view of the world. So this is when we take on the big picture questions. We start with things like economic collapse. We looked at Venezuela, which was once a very thriving capitalist economy and is now in total collapse. We look at business cycles, booms and expansions and busts, recessions, the labor market, monetary and fiscal policy, which, boy, is taking a lot of our attention right now. But also with those building blocks, we tackle the big themes, which include inequality, economic justice, poverty, the cost of saving the earth, which, how much would it cost us to really make a dent on climate change? How capitalism compares to other systems and how it might change to have different kinds of results. So all of those are the big things that we really tackle in the fall. And it's a really exciting, dynamic thing. And I think for a lot of people who've been maybe reporting in a kind of a narrow area, it's mind opening. And I like to see like the light bulbs go off in the class. Right now, they're writing an assignment on reparations, like what might the impact be on the economy and on individuals? What forms might it take? as we're sort of addressing economic justice at this moment in time. And then in the spring, which I'll give a little short shrift to maybe because I started so big, but the spring is a little bit more micro. So we look much more at industries and companies and markets and how those things work together. So you get a little bit more of the nitty gritty in exciting ways. Some students really thrive on that. In past years, we've done things like evaluate Uber's IPO. Should you buy into this? Is it going to be a good one? How will investors do? We've looked at Tesla. We've looked at the financials of Tesla versus GM. We've taken apart the financials of Netflix. We've looked at sort of the corporate decision making, like what is the role of the corporation and how does it make its decisions? And how do investors evaluate those assets that they may own? So marketing, IPO, mergers, regulation, Disney versus Netflix, GM versus Tesla. Those are all good fodder for the spring and a lot of fun too.
Great. And another cool aspect of our programs is you get the chance to interact with a lot of leading professionals related to the fields you're studying. So I know every year it probably changes the array of people that get to come visit your class, but you talk about some of the journalists, the business people, and the academics who sometimes come in and give people a lot of insight into the subject at hand.
Yeah, so this year, I'll just start off talking about some of who we've had so far this year. It's been a really good one, in part because of the pandemic. Since so many people are having to do this remotely, very few people say no. And so I've been reaching out to all of my favorite people and the best people. Our very first outside economist was Torsten Slok. He was consistently rated the #1 economist on Wall Street by Institutional Investor. He recently left Deutsche Bank to go to Apollo. And he came in person from Brooklyn, where he's working remotely in his jeans, and got up in front of the class and did his whole spiel and gave them like lots of great insights. And he's top grade, top tier. And that's just one example. I've had in Seth Carpenter, who's another top economist on Wall Street, and who spent many years at the Fed. We had Diane Swank recently, who's at Grant Thornton in Chicago, also a really dynamic journalist, economist who works with journalists and who's very focused on economic justice and very passionate. And honestly, I think one of the things the students took away from that was not only her passion for like what we need to do to help the people who are not getting help now in this economy, but she talked about her own personal experiences. She's dyslexic. She has a PhD economist from Michigan. She can't really read. She's had to do everything by audio, and she is really impressive. And I think having overcome those kind of hurdles was a reminder to people about, what you can achieve and why we need to think about fairness through all things. So that was terrific. But those are a couple. We've also had a former Columbia researcher actually who's done a lot of work on baby bonds, which is one form of reparations that's been discussed, a way to give money to a group that's been systemically discriminated against and has less wealth. And she's done a lot of work in that field. And she came on and talked with us about her research into that. On journalists, I've had lots of different folks. Let's see, we had David Papadopoulos, who's from Bloomberg earlier this year, who's an expert on Venezuela. Had Greg Gippin last night from the Wall Street Journal and The Economist, who's covered the Fed for many years. I've had a couple of Pulitzer winners who are dear friends and have done great work over the years. David Koshanevsky, who writes about taxes and other kinds of financial crimes, and Gretchen Morgenson, who's gone from the Times to the Wall Street Journal and now to NBC. And I could kind of go on and on, but we represent, I think, all the major publications with people who have expertise in specific areas. So I'll bring an economist with specific expertise in like the labor market or on the Fed or something like that. And they take the students through what we should be thinking about. And it's a lot of fun.
Great. And in addition to all this great knowledge and insight, people will get into areas of the economy and how businesses operate. I think a lot of students are also interested in gaining some investigative abilities and better skills in that. What are some ways within this program they might be able to sharpen their skills as investigators and maybe do projects with that kind of skill set?
Yeah, so I'm really open to this. I find that it depends a lot on the student's initiative and their own skill set. There is a program called Investigative Essentials that's in the MA, which is not in my seminar, but it's one of the things you'll be doing in the school, which is a great foundational effort on it. Okay. And that's really useful. That includes things like FOIAs and how to get information from government sources and things along that line. I also think that actually what we're talking about here is getting comfortable with going after experts and being able to analyze data is a key component of learning how to be an investigative journalist. In other words, you're not just relying on what people tell you. You're not just relying on information that comes out, but you're figuring out where the weaknesses are and how to take it apart. And I think that's one of the most important skills that can come from all of this. But we also tried something at the end of last spring, not sure exactly how we're going to structure it this year, but after the thesis was done, this is a little different because this year theses are being done through the summer. We're having an unusual year, but typically the thesis is done sometime in April. Early April. And so there's another, month or so of school left. And we did an investigative project in our class where we broke up into little groups and everybody tried to find an accountability, sort of a mini investigative little piece to work on. And we did that through the spring. And it was pretty good. And we published a couple of them and that was terrific. They were published in various places. And so I think that's another way we can do it. For those who have the interest, you can certainly pursue some data journalism and some other pieces that are available to you that we could work with either in your thesis or in projects that you do in class.
Great, and you already brought up the topic of the master's thesis, which is a ambitious work of journalism that each student in the MA program will embark on, usually written, but sometimes in other multimedia formats. It's usually around 8,000 words, I believe, for the master's thesis. Winnie, can you talk about how you work with the business students on developing those and how they get paired with you or other mentors in the school to work through that over the academic year?
Yeah. It is really one of the highlights of the year. There's no way of getting around it. Many folks have not had the opportunity to work on something long form like that. And it also could be in another media, by the way. There are exceptions, and it requires actually more work and more effort, but we've had podcast and video efforts done. But typically it's an 8,000 word written piece. And the challenge to do something of 8,000 words is very different than 3,000 or 5,000 words. It requires a lot more planning and scope. And some students come in with an idea. Sometimes there's something they've really wanted to get to the bottom of and they haven't had time. Oftentimes, the idea comes to them working with their advisor here on campus. And many of the faculty advise on these, like I can't advise on all of them, but many of the faculty advise. So working with Jane Eisner, who runs the MA program, everybody will get an advisor. And then that advisor, they all work a little bit differently, but the basic structure is the same. You're going to try to settle on an idea that has sort of the components. I sometimes like to think of it as like, imagine a big New Yorker story. Like, what would it take to have that heft? So you're probably going to be looking for a narrative device. You're probably going to look for something that bears some explanation, and it's probably going to be a rather extensive reporting effort. One of the exciting parts, which is not going to happen this winter so much, and may not even happen until next summer or later, but students apply for money, and then we give grants to let them travel to report these out. And so I'm assuming post-pandemic, which is hopefully not too far in the future, we'll be right back on track to do that. And many students travel even internationally to work on their thesis. Working with your advisor, you'll block it out. You'll come up with a plan of attack. You'll come up with a focus. You'll do a lot of reporting long before you go on the road, because that's really important. You'll put together a timeline probably. You'll probably put together an outline of ideas. You'll probably put together a resources list of the information that you're drawing on. And then you're going to try to shape a big, long narrative piece. And it's very exciting. It's also a lot of work. So the winter tends to be pretty intense.
Great, thanks. And do you have any examples of some recent projects that students have completed in the last couple of years?
Yeah, sure. Larry Madawa, who's now at the BBC, came in wanting to write about the company that we call the Amazon of Africa, Jumia, which was the first African company to list on the New York Stock Exchange. And he had done just enough reporting around the edges to think that there were a lot of questions about this company, both on its profitability, on how it was running things. And he also felt like it was being financed and started by people outside of Africa, but who were trying to cash in on the fact that it was African. So he did a lot of reporting across several countries and published part of it, indeed, after he graduated. So that was kind of exciting. I've had other students pick, again, companies isn't often, for the people in my section, they often will focus on a company. One student wanted to write about Sunbasket, which was one of these meal service companies, and he had great access. He had a way to get into the company and talk to the CFO and what's their competition like with Blue Apron and others going public. Could they go public? Could they be bought? What was the arc of the company? So that's the kind of example, but they go into lots of different directions. Hong Kong real estate was one last year. They can go many, many different directions. It could be a single tale. It could be something more investigative. Wide open.
Great. And stepping outside of the journalism school for a moment, one of the key things about the MA program is students in that program take 3 classes outside of the journalism school as part of their curriculum. We call them 3 electives. Within the business concentration, 2 of those classes are set. Those are financial accounting and corporate finance, and then 1 class that might be up to each student to kind of choose what area they want to learn more about. Can you talk about why those 2 classes, financial accounting and corporate finance, are important things for people to learn about while they're at Columbia?
So look, I believe in this. I really do. My experience hiring people and working with reporters is those who understand sort of accounting and corporate finance are capable of doing more in-depth work and generally excelling in a way that I would expect at a national sort of platform. And I believe that's important, even if you're not going to do that for the rest of your career. One student told me, well, at least it's going to help me run my own little freelance business on the side. And that's true too. But accounting is sort of the cornerstone of understanding how businesses work and how money flows work. So again, whether you're trying to understand, an education budget or the government budget or Tesla's balance sheet, you're going to need a little bit of understanding of how that works. And you want to be able to, when you interview the CEO or the CFO or whoever it is on the earnings call, you want to understand what's going on and be able to ask them probing questions. And so you're going to need that kind of understanding and expertise. So accounting is in the fall, and then corporate finance builds on accounting. It's a little harder, but accounting is a prerequisite for it. And so that's like a much deeper dive. And I think for those who don't have a lot of exposure to markets or corporate decision making, it's really sort of key to being able to understand and put yourself in the other shoes. In my class, in the economics class in the fall, I'm often asking students to imagine themselves as the consumer. And then I turn around and say, okay, now you're the CEO of that company. What do you do? And they're like, huh? And I want them to be able to put themselves in that position so they can understand the choices and the decisions that are being made. And that really does help in that fashion.
Great. And I should mention too, for people who are maybe thinking about this, those classes can be taken for pass-fail as opposed to for a letter grade if people choose to, I think, go into those classes trying to learn as much as they can, but maybe aren't as, hung up about GPAs. And that's an important thing. Within the whole program at the MA, everything can be taken for pass-fail as opposed to a number GPA.
Yeah, and honestly, those classes work best if you work in groups. Students work together in those classes and they kind of puzzle through them and they learn together. And it's a very different kind of working style, I think, than we often do in our writing class seminars. So I think they get a lot out of it, actually.
Great. And then you mentioned Larry Modelo already being at the BBC. I was going to ask about some of the other career paths of grads of the MA Business program. If you wanted to speak about where some people have wound up working and what the demand seems to be in the journalism world for kind of skilled journalism reporter or skilled business journalism reporters.
Yeah. Look, so first off, I'd say there is a lot of demand. And I think that's one of the reasons you should consider, this concentration and getting this background. Whether you think ultimately you're going to write about arts and you want to have some understanding of, the financials behind the arts businesses, or if you want to be a foreign correspondent, there is demand for this, people who can understand it and can go forward. I know it because I've been in hiring positions for years, and I can tell when someone good comes along. In terms of where my students have wound up, it's really all across the board. I can name drop here a little bit, which I'll do, but I want to be clear that there's the full range of places where people wind up. It really depends on your skills coming in. If you've got like incredible clips and you've been able to do big, scoops or memorable stories at a large publication, yes, you can get hired there. Otherwise, you're going to have to build your way up, which is what a lot of people do. Larry had been at the BBC. He's back there. He's now covering the United States and out of Washington for the BBC. But I have people like, not in my program, but before my year, Kieran Ho is now at the Atlantic. Nick Cuerlo from a couple of years ago was at Bloomberg. I have folks at the Wall Street Journal, Real Deal, Business Insider, CoinDesk. One of my students does production on the air at CBS. But I've also had students who've taken, or students from this program who've taken other paths, and I sort of want to acknowledge that's okay too. It was a foreign student who maybe was not quite as skilled as writing in English, and I'm doing a book abroad, and then he wound up running the Davos World Economic Forum as administrator there. So another one went on to work for the UN, and others doing research in Washington. So these kind of skills to be able to write and to communicate and to understand these complex business topics are in great demand. In fact, I just got a note from someone's at the tax writing committees in Congress saying, I'm really looking for somebody who can write about this in an easily accessible way. You know anybody? So we get a lot of those kinds of comments. These skills can kind of carry on, although obviously we're trying to help everyone launch a career in journalism. Some will choose other paths.
Great. And then going back to thinking about applying to a program like this, what would you say would make for a good, strong application to this particular program? What are you looking for when you get an application to the MA Business degree?
You know, I get really excited when I see someone who's a very fluid writer, because I think if you can express yourself well, you know, then come here and let us help you delve into some ideas really deeply that can animate your thinking and make you a more sophisticated, deeper, accomplished journalist. So that's always the exciting part of it, right? So we like to see your clips. We like to see, and it also could be visual. I understand that. We certainly have people coming in for broadcast, more and more audio. I acknowledge that too. If you're a storyteller, it translates. It doesn't have to be in the written word. So if you're a good storyteller, that's like, well, the first thing we're looking for. I also want to see someone who has not struggled perhaps in undergrad, just because I think they've got that accounting and corporate finance class, and it's a lot of work. I know a lot of people think, oh, you're taking a year off and going back to school. Well, it's not bad. My students, I can assure you, are working really hard and they're feeling a little overwhelmed. So you want someone who's who has an appetite for doing the academic work, someone who's a good writer, and maybe someone who's got, like, as we said before, a little bit of experience in journalism. Now, how much and exactly what, there's a little bit of give in there. And there's always a student or two who, like, has been in business and wants to become a journalist, you know, and we always have a discussion about whether they're best fitted for the MS or the MA program. So it depends on their skills. But, you know, I'm looking for that passion for journalism, the ability to write, and a little bit of the skills that show that, you know, you're on that track.
Great. And we're getting some questions in the chat. Please ask more if you have any on your mind, but we have one already about kind of expanding about the data analysis you mentioned some of the students worked on in the seminar. Can you talk a little bit about more in depth about what that involved and how students got more data knowledge through their studies in the program?
Yeah, so that was a little experiment I launched right in the middle of the pandemic. So, you know, I don't want to use it as the test case for everything, because things were kind of thrown haywire by everybody suddenly going home. And frankly, many of my students wound up not in New York at all, and they were trying to do things in New York. So it was a little difficult to execute, but the goal was to come up with accountability ideas. So, you know, one of the things that we wound up looking at was pharmacies and drugstores in New York and whether they were getting COVID funds or not, because many of them were starting to struggle outside of the big couple of chains. And so they were trying to look at data for drugstores across boroughs to see who had access and what their businesses were like and whether they were struggling. So they got a lot of the way there of where they wanted to be on that one in particular. There were several others that they went halfway on, because we decided in the end to, like, focus on one effort instead of to, like, splinter it, because we had a abbreviated time. But some of it was coming up with the idea and then trying to figure out where the data might be and how to massage it. Right now, like I said, on the reparations thing, or in the poverty, we had a poverty assignment recently in my class. The students were all sent out to get, you know, after we'd spent some time in class on it, get original data on poverty. And it didn't have to be the United States. I have a student in Brazil and one in Peru and other people in different places. And then come back and do a pitch for me on poverty and how you would write about poverty, you know, something interesting about it. And so they spent a lot of time looking at data and trying to come back and give us some sense of what might be a good story in that space. For many of them, I think it's just kind of shocking to find out, you know, that in the US, you know, we have such a high rate of child poverty, so much than the rest of the Western world. Like, why is that?
Mm-hmm. Great. We had a question going back to the application about whether you're looking for people who've done well in terms of math, in terms of classes they've done in the past. Is that a real key part of what you're looking for in the applicant, the math skills, performance in math classes?
No. You don't have to be a business journalist. I guess that's the one thing I always want to get across. I'm not looking for people who, you know, if you're a well-established business journalist who's already doing this, you know, at the Wall Street Journal, you know, maybe you wouldn't come, maybe you would, but good chance that you're on your way. We're looking for people who would be comfortable in that environment, though. I mean, I think if you feel like, oh my God, I can't, you know, I think everybody can do it, but I recognize there are some people who really do not ever want to look at a number, and maybe this isn't for you. You want to be inquisitive enough to understand it and curious enough. I would say I remember when I was young, the first probability and statistics class I took when I was very young, it was like my eyes opened. I'm like, oh, I get it now. I want you to have those kind of moments where you go, oh, okay, I see it, I understand it. But I don't expect math majors. I always seem to get a few economics majors, but many of my students aren't. And I find that that's really a nice blend, that the people who are really naturally good at math work with the people who are really naturally writers, and they help each other build their skills.
Great, thanks. And we had a question from someone who is currently in the Bay Area and wants to cover tech as a journalist. And is wondering if this is a good program for that goal and how someone might be able to explore tech issues through the business MA.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people come through the program who are really interested in tech. And actually, I think it'd be kind of cool, maybe down the road, there should be even more of a tech component between the science MA and mine. But for now, I would say many of the students do go on to cover tech. So it tells me it's a pretty good launching pad for it. And one of the things I tell the students often is they have a lot of leeway in the written assignments that they do for me. Like we'll take on a topic, but then like we did something on the labor market, and so or minimum wage. And so I said, come back to me with a pitch on the labor market minimum wage. So you can choose, you do your research and you can choose what you want to write about. If you're really interested in tech, well, you'd probably pick a tech company or a tech industry and do that one. And then when we come to something on, on privacy, you might pick something in a tech company on that. And your thesis, you might do your thesis on something in the tech space. So, and then when you get to the spring, we do financial analysis. You're going to understand how earnings better and balance sheet and income statements for tech companies. So that's the kind of work you'll build on. I think it's transferable to others, but if you've got that kind of interest from the get-go, then I would suggest you just go with it, and you would take an elective probably that builds on that as well.
Great. And this person also was wondering, with that tech interest, whether the dual degree in computer science and journalism we offer would be a good route for that. As I understand it, that program is really about building apps and kind of platforms, doing a lot of building of applications as opposed to potentially like reporting on tech. I think that's maybe the distinction if you would agree with that.
Yeah, no, thank you for helping me. I'm still learning my way here through some of the programs at the school. But yeah, that tends to be a very computer heavy class. So a programming heavy kind of class, right? Where they try to understand how journalists would query questions, how you would query data, which is how I think about it. And so if you're what I would say a typical journalist these days who maybe knows a little R and a little Python and knows how to query data, you're probably not going to do the data program unless what you want to do is to full-time go into working on those kinds of programs. And if you do, that might be a really great program for you. And it's a small program, so I think that's somewhat fungible, but it's definitely pushing you in that direction, as opposed to my program, or our program, which will be more about learning to produce a 8,000 word piece of journalism and how to do smaller stories and how to understand how the economy and businesses work.
Great. And we got a question from someone asking who's interested actually in the politics concentration about whether they could pursue some economic classes as part of the MA. I believe that would be true. And I guess I'd flip that over and say, like, if you're in the MA business concentration, we'd be able to, in that third elective that's open to everyone's discretion, maybe explore something in the more political realm, international affairs, things like that, that might be kind of at the intersection of politics and business and the economy.
Yeah, a lot of students do that. They take an international affairs as popular. There's a legal course that's really popular. And I also think that's a really foundational course. Like if you're really interested in doing more investigative work, if you get a little bit of a legal background and you get a little bit better financial background, those are sort of like the, and you got a little bit of data background, that's sort of the plug and play things you need. So I try to encourage people to do that. I think it's my seminar in particular, you can't take if you're in one of the other concentrations. I just want to be clear on that. I don't want to confuse people because it's a big commitment and you can't really manage that. That's more than you could manage. I'm happy to have people sit in once in a while. It seems like it's almost impossible to ever manage because people's schedules are so complicated. But every once in a while, somebody will sit in from another concentration, and that's fine. Happy to have it. But it's a little tough. I feel like I should answer the tech person by saying, next week we're doing a unit on antitrust, which I always look forward to. It's a very complex area of the law. And the recent case against Google will be front and center. And the woman who's actually been very, very involved in representing the government and advising it for years on this, Lena Khan, is at Columbia, and she's going to speak to the class next Wednesday. So I'm really excited. She's usually way too busy, but somehow because of the pandemic and she can do it from home, she's like, okay, yeah, I'll hop on. So I'm very excited to have her next week on that conversation.
Great. And we have a question about kind of the projects you do in the seminar, if there's opportunities to do group work with some of your classmates, or is it all individual? And maybe that's also an entry point to talk a little bit about some of the other assignments in terms of writing and reporting that people will do in addition to the master's thesis in the seminar.
Yeah. Yeah, so it varies a bit from year to year and from semester to semester. I've definitely tried to have a little bit more group work, but I do find that most people are eager to do more of their own work. Like it's one of the things they want to get out of the course. So maybe they'll start, like as a group of 3 on a topic, but then they each write their own piece. We've done that once or twice. And as I said, I liked the idea in the spring, assuming we were to get back to a normal master's schedule, thesis schedule, that we would have time to work on a small project in groups of 3 or so, 3 or 4 maybe. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that. I try to do a little bit more group work for conversations or debates in the class. Most of the writing is sort of done individually, and I think that's probably pretty useful. Although I have had students like group report something out. Like we did something on vaping 2 years ago, because that was something the students were really interested in. And they did the reporting as a group. They split it up. They split up the assignments. One person went to get consumers, somebody else went to get the experts, and then they each wrote their own story. So it made the collecting of the information a little bit easier at a time when that can be hard to do. So we might do another one like that, but mostly we try to focus on writing. The assignments can vary. What I've been doing this fall, which I think is working pretty well, is I asked the students to give a pitch for a story of a few hundred words. And then after 2 pitches, I asked them to take one of those 2 pitches and turn it into a full-fledged story. So, and we do 3 or 4 of those. So they get to, think through how they would approach a handful of topics, but there's not enough time to develop each one of those into a really elaborate piece. So we kind of trade off. Like the next one, I think there'll be between climate and immigration. So people will do a pitch on each of those, and then they will do a full-fledged piece, which will be probably around 1,000 words. And it'll probably, they'll have a lot of room in how they handle the topic, and I'll try to help them focus it. And as a matter of fact, I just had an hour-long session on the one they're working on now, where they all came to me with questions about, what about this? And how do I do this? And how do I find real people? So we try to talk about the journalism as well.
Great. We had a follow-up about that 3rd elective class that students will be able to choose in the spring semester. If you knew of any of the subjects other students have chosen in the past, or things they've tried to supplement their business knowledge with by taking that elective?
Yeah, like I said, there's a legal course under John Coffey, who's a well-known person here at the school. It's really popular. There's several SIPA courses, which is the School of International and Public Affairs, which are really popular. Some of the international courses, and that could just depend on what your interests are in the international arena. There's also an economics course over there for a couple of my students who are really interested in what I was doing. And like, I only go so far, right? If you want to go deeper, you can go over there and find something that's like much more robust. And some of the students also do things. Last fall, I had a couple students who were also just auditing a couple of language courses, which is something else you could do. One was doing Egyptian, I think, and so there's some, you can find outlets for a lot of different interest, and then that course is going to just depend on what you want. I can think of, I don't think there's a commonality. Some people have a real interest in technology, so there's some who were looking at the disinformation courses that were coming out. It just depends on your interest.
And then we had a question about publication opportunities for people to potentially publish master's thesis, as well as some of those shorter projects, and what kind of advice they might be able to get from faculty about how to best pitch things or get things placed somewhere.
Okay, several part answer here. Yes, you can. Last year, I did have a student who had like sort of some connections to someone at Forbes, and he was actually did a couple pieces that broke down and evaluated the various tax proposals coming from the candidates heading into the Democratic nomination. And those were published just fine, pretty much as he did them for my class. That's a little unusual, but he had a connection and that worked for him, and that was great. Some other students have managed to publish smaller bits depending on what they were doing. There's also Bill Gruskin's new service, which I can't describe as well as I should. Maybe I'll let Ross do it better than I could, where they're trying to publish here through the university to make it available for people to publish. This isn't for pay or anything, but just to publish some of the best works from the classes. So they've published a few already this year. There'll be more before the year is out. That's an opportunity to potentially get clips. I would say if you want to, you want to write things as a freelancer, we try to tell people you don't have a lot of time, that it's deceptively busy. The course load may not seem that much until you get here, and then it can kind of overwhelm you. So completing a draft of something for me is terrific. It may not be nearly as complete as you would need to do for publication. Secondly, for foreign students, there are some restrictions on their visas. And so I don't want to tread into water that could be complicated. So if you're a foreign student, you should consult with someone besides me on that to make sure that you're getting good advice. Many students publish at least a portion of their thesis somewhere. 8,000 words, there aren't that many publications that'll take 8,000 words from someone who's starting out, but often they'll publish a portion of it, or they'll publish it in a couple different pieces in a couple different ways. So we do see that happen a good bit. And actually someone who's been working as a TA for me the last couple of years, she turned her thesis into a book and was published a couple of years ago. That does happen as well.
Great. And there's a question about, I think you alluded to like the group dynamics, students learning from each other, people helping with journalism kind of mentorship, as well as business and kind of math mentorship. Could you talk a little bit about what the student community is like within the MA business cohort, and kind of your insights into what the vibe is, I guess, of the program?
Ooh, the vibe. It varies a little bit from year to year, to be perfectly honest. This year's vibe is really passionate and terrific. I don't think anybody is here who's not super committed this year, because it's hard. The pandemic environment has made things more difficult. And I also think it has had a little bit of effect on how easy it is to grow close to people. So I'm teaching a class where I have usually 6 students in class and usually 4 remote. And we're sitting long distances apart wearing masks. So it does probably, and I'm projecting really loud all the time to make sure everybody can hear. So it doesn't have maybe as easy a discourse as we often have had in past years, which I look forward to having back again in the near future. But I think it's made up for, like I said, by the passion of the students and the commitment, which is really extraordinary. Like nobody's wasting time. They're here. And also probably because there's not like these thousands of undergrads running around on campus, the people who are here have like a much closer connection. And that's nice to see. So I think there's an incredible commitment, more than I've ever felt before. And maybe it's partly because of this moment in journalism is so intense. I mean, let's face it, who won't be happy to turn the calendar on 2020?
And I just got a quick question I can answer very quickly, which is whether the GRE is required to apply to this program. The answer is no. For none of our master's of programs, except for the dual degree in computer science and journalism, is that required. So no standardized tests are necessary to be an applicant to this program. Great. And I think that's almost it for the chat. I'd like to thank everyone for all of their great questions. And we'd be happy to answer any other questions that come up as you think about applying throughout the season at apply.journalism@columbia.edu. And I would recommend, for people who are thinking about applying, to look at our deadlines, which are posted on our site to apply for the MA program. Our deadline for this coming application season will be January 6, 2021. So that's coming up in about almost 2 months away now. Yeah, I can't believe time is going by this fast. So if you have questions about the application process, feel welcome to reach out to us. And if you have questions about the MA business concentration, Professor Okelly has put her email in the chat here, so I think you're welcome to reach out to her as well. Well, thank you, Winnie. Thank you for taking the time to chat with everyone. And thank you again from everyone around the world who came in to ask questions and learn more about this program. And we look forward to hearing from you. We hope you have a great day or a great night wherever you are. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.